deal. Good to be back in the metropolis of Splitlog. It is good to be back. I love this area. It reminds me of my home. I live in Watertown, Tennessee, and everybody always goes, "Where's that?" I'm like, exactly. We live just right outside of Nashville. James chapter 2, by the way. We live right outside of Nashville, and I like country. I do. We love it. We love where we live. 20 minutes from nowhere, We live 20 minutes out in the middle of nowhere, and then 20 minutes from everywhere. So we've got everything close to us, but not close enough where you have to see it. So it's I feel like that when I come around this area, especially when you're leaving. I think it's 49, maybe. Is that the highway goes through here? You go through the canyon or whatever. Is that a canyon or big rocks on the side? Whatever you guys have. It's gorgeous, man. I love it. We have the same thing down on the way from Watertown to Murfreesboro. Just the bones of the country. I love it. So, and then of course, love seeing you guys and a lot of new faces, and everybody's getting bigger. Your kids are getting older, and then your kids are having kids, and it's awesome. I want to share with you this week, and we've been kind of stabbing at where we're going to be at this week, but we looked at Titus Friday night and Saturday night. But I want to spend the remainder of the week in the book of James, which is where we've been studying the last couple years. We end up taking kind of hiatuses and doing different kind of studies, and this last been 2 years since I've been here. We did study through the first 8 chapters of Romans, which was a great study, and been putting that in book form, and then we did some stuff in Titus and Revelation and in John and in Hebrews, but we're back in James and dealing with chapter 3, which we might get to chapter 3 this week. But I really would like to focus with you in beginning in chapter 2. And there's some new terminology, some new language, kind of hand motions, new ways of talking about some things that I think is rather helpful. I like the book of James because I think it's extremely applicable for the church in which we live today. The book of James, the letter that James writes, is the first letter in our New Testament. It's written about a decade after the death of Jesus. And so you have a lot of, if you go back and think about it, you have a lot of really kind of neat things that are going on in the church at this time. People that had been healed. Well, first off, people that had probably seen Jesus being crucified. I mean, they actually witnessed that. People who had been healed. Lazarus hasn't died probably again. He's still alive. People that had been healed of leprosy and children that had been raised from the dead. All these phenomenal things that had taken place. They were around. So kids in the youth group had parents who had experienced all of that. So Christianity was all brand new. Now, some of the side effects of that is that Gentiles, which would be you and I, have not come around yet. Paul, at the writing of this letter, Paul had not even come to Jerusalem yet. He was probably done persecuting the church and went off and was working with Barnabas and kind of coming to grips with Jesus and who he is. And we know about that from some of his writings. 14 years he went off and studied. But, there's no Gentiles. The temple had not been destroyed. Rome hadn't come in and shut everything down. So Christianity is in its infancy. Now, consider this. Why that's important is because James is writing to a Jewish church. And he's writing to a Jewish church that lived, and this is just some of my new language, but I like it. James is writing to a church that for 4,000 years lived in what we would call this kind of a relationship with God. In Old Covenant Judaism, God was here and man was here, and they never mixed. There was language for God. God was high and lifted up. Man was not. God was holy. Man is not. And God operated different than man. He saw different from man. He's not just, it wasn't like he just knew the truth. He is the truth. How he thinks is right. How he feels is right. And all throughout an Old Testament time period, that was never confused. In other words, God was never like, I'm holy and you're not, except for Bob. He probably is a little bit. Okay? No, there was no Bobs around. Okay? God is holy, man is not, and they never mixed. And anytime you have the prophets, Isaiah stands in the presence of God, and Elijah and says, whoa, man, I'm a man of unclean lips. You are totally different than I am. God is holy and man is not. And so this relationship in the Old Testament, God never expected mankind, hear this, God never expected mankind in an Old Covenant hour to be like he is. God expected mankind to do what he says. And God says, do not kill. And man would say, okay. And God gave the law, and man surrendered to it. And it was this kind of relationship. Now, you'd say, well, that's, and James is talking to a group who's lived like that their whole life. The reason we talk about that, and the reason why I think the book of James is so helpful for our church, is I'm finding as we travel, there's a version of Christianity that's out there and kind of present that looks a lot like that. Like God is out there and I'm here. You know, I come to see him on Sunday. And I tell him how great he is. I've been harping on this for a while, so I might have said this the last time I was here, but I have a nephew, and he's a big basketball fan. He's from Indiana, you know, where real basketball is played. And so I go up and visit him a couple years ago. It was back when Steph Curry was like real big, you know, and he's still big, but I mean, 2015 shocked the world and just did all this stuff. And that's who he's basically talking about. You know, we go up for Thanksgiving, and he's telling me about his favorite team and his favorite player on that team. And he's like, you'd like him. You know, he's a Christian. Talking about one of these guys. And I didn't want to make a beef on that. I don't know personal lives of these guys. But I said, how do you know he's a Christian? Because every time he hits a three, he does this. Which we all know, that's what makes you a Christian, obviously, right? You know, that's what makes us a Christian. See, that smells like this to me. Well, I'm a Christian. How do you know? I go to church on Sunday. Yeah, that smells like this to me. I mean, Christians go to church on Sunday, and we all know as long as you come to church on Sunday, you're a Christian, correct? Yeah, see, it gets complicated. See, that with Christianity, God never designed for you and I to live like this. In fact, some of the old covenant, we get confused. Like we talk about the 10 Commandments, and this becomes bizarre. I said this at a church not long ago, and they all looked at me like, this guy's a heretic. Because I said the statement, as a Christian, you do not live according to the 10 Commandments. You do not. They're not bad, but the 10 Commandments were not given to make you like God. That's not why the 10 Commandments were given. Paul says the law was given to reveal sin. God said in the law, this is who I am. And mankind says, oh, I can't be that. God says, I know. I know. So the law was never given to produce righteousness. In fact, if you could be righteous by observing the law, you don't need Jesus. You don't have to come to church. You just go golfing. So it's difficult when you're talking about some of these things about Christianity, you know, it's almost helpful at times to describe what Christianity is not, because we want to make religion, we want to make Judaism, God is out there and I'm here, you know, and I'm living for him and you're awesome and I believe who you are. All that's great, but that's old covenant stuff. And when we begin to apply that, it makes sense. Let me give you an example of this and just some different things. In the Old Covenant, God said, do not commit adultery. Okay? We all know that. Are you with me? In the Old Testament, God said, do not commit adultery. That is a rule. Now, remember, God does not expect you to be like him, because you and I, in the Old Covenant hour before Jesus came, man did not see the way God saw. He just doesn't. Man is not holy. No one in the Old Covenant was holy. No one was like God in an Old Covenant hour. So God didn't expect you to see the way he saw and feel the way he felt. You lived in response to the law. So in the Old Covenant, God said, do not commit adultery. And you didn't, hey, I'm not going to commit adultery. But In an old covenant system, see, I could look at you and say, well, yeah, hey, I'm never going to cheat on my wife. I mean, she can't live forever. Yeah. I mean, hey. In fact, there's this lady down the street. I've been, hey, but I'm not going to cheat on my wife with her, Just think my wife's going to die in the next couple of years anyway, so it'll work out. Now, you and I, we would talk like that, and immediately you would say, this guy's crazy. That's weird. That's not right. But that was okay here. Because I didn't do that. See, the Old Testament says, in the Old Covenant, God says, don't kill, don't murder. So I'm not going to kill my neighbor. As he leaves, I'm not going to, in the morning, gets in his car, drives out, I'm not going to kill him. But I can look at him and say, hope you die today. But I'm not going to kill him. Not going to kill him. Oh, he died? Yes. I didn't kill him. Now, you and I would look at that and say, well, that's not right, because we understand there's a whole nother level of relationship that God wants us to have with him. So Christianity is not about the law. My neighbor, I led my neighbor to the Lord this last year, and he was an atheist, which is hysterical. It's a great story. I'll tell you later this week. But seriously, it was awesome. But he would always tell me, well, I'm not a bad guy. I don't steal. Oh, because everyone who, as long as you don't steal, you're a Christian. Well, no, but I don't kill anybody. Oh, and as long as you don't kill anybody, you're a Christian. See, all of that is under this kind of are you following me? So there's a difference between being religious and acknowledging God, knowing that he exists and having information about him, and being a Christian. So James, if you're with me, James is talking to a group of people who for 4,000 years lived in a culture like this. They came to a temple. This is not a temple. In fact, really, this isn't even a sanctuary. It's a facility. You are the sanctuary. In a new covenant hour, God went from an Old Testament time period like this and said, what I want with you is I want to invite you into intimacy with me. I want to come down and live in your body. And I don't want you to just do what I'm telling you. I want you to feel the way that I feel. I want you to see the way. That's what Charlene was saying. He's coming back for a holy church. Well, hold on. God's the only one that's holy, and I'm not. That's true. But God has invited you to operate in his holiness. He wants to come down and live in your body and not just make you do different things. He wants you to feel the way that he feels. And again, the illustration I just gave you about adultery and murder, that was kind of a beefed up example of what I went through with my daughter a couple years ago. Because my son and my wife teaches martial arts. She teaches Taekwondo. She's a black belt, and my kids are black belts. So we have some pretty strict rules in our home about fighting, because it's awesome. I mean, from a fatherly perspective, I'm torn, because I'm like, this is not good. On the other side, I'm like, this is so entertaining. This is awesome. Okay, but the father side wins out. And so we have some pretty strict rules in our home about not fighting, not hitting especially. But when it comes down to it, I'm really not concerned about the rule of not hitting. I don't want them to want to hit. And the whole illustration of adultery was how I communicated that to my daughter and my son as well. But my daughter, it was really shocking, because I was telling her about, why I don't cheat on my wife. And Elena says, why don't you cheat on mommy? I said, well, she doesn't like it, Yeah, she'd be upset. And Elena was like, oh, well, that's not right. And I was like, well, why isn't it right? Because there's motive behind it. That's Christianity. See, it's not that I just don't want you to hit your brother. I don't want you to want to hit him. Well, why don't you beat on mommy, Dad? Well, she'll send me to jail, It makes me look bad in front of the church, so I don't do it, Just live with the woman. Well, that's not how we as Christians talk, because there's something wrong on the inside. So you and I all know it's not just activity-oriented. Hear this, folks, this is strong. You can follow a Christian around and do everything that a Christian does. Don't smoke, drink, or chew, or go with girls who do. Go to church on Sunday. Wear the white clothing. Don't watch bad shows. Give the evangelist money. All the stuff that you really need to do as a Christian, Christians do. You could follow a Christian around and do all the things that a Christian does and not be a Christian. Because Christianity isn't this. Christianity is this. Are you with me? It's kind of a long introduction, but this is what he's been talking about. So when we're talking about when you accept Jesus Christ in your life, whether you know it or not, and you do, especially when you first get saved, God comes down to live inside of you. We all know that, right? Are you with me? God comes and lives in your body. You're not just like, well, I started going to this church and, adopted some new principles. And no. In fact, the language I used this weekend was, Paul's language on this is so graphic. Paul says to the church in Corinth, do not unite yourself with a prostitute. Because in so doing, you are uniting Christ's body with a prostitute. You say, what does he mean by that? If you're a Christian, this is no longer your own. You share, he lives inside of you, literally. You share the same brain. He dwells within you. I told a junior hire this some time ago, and I'm teaching and preaching at this camp, and I look down and these boys, you know how junior high goofy boys are, and so they're just sitting there, and I looked down at this one boy, and I said, if you're a Christian, whatever you look at, Jesus looks at. He goes, that's Christianity, man. Seriously. That's the whole New Testament. Read through it. You're going to find you're his eyes and you're his feet. What you allow to go through your mind goes through his mind. And you can talk to any old timer who's walked with the Lord for a long time. God, at times in their life, when they're just living and talking with someone, he will literally bring thought. I think Charlene said this. He'll bring thoughts unbidden to your mind. You taught that in Sunday school this morning. He'll bring thoughts unbidden to your mind. His thoughts go through your mind. He opens your eyes. He doesn't tell you what to do. He shows you. He opens your eyes so you see different. Jesus called it having sight. He looked at the leaders of Israel and said, you're blind. And then looked at the blind man and said, you can see. What's he talking about? The difference between this and this. So God doesn't want to, he's not living in heaven barking orders for you to do things. God wants to come down and live inside of you and say, I want to change the way you see your wife. I want to change the way you see your husband. I want to change the way you see your next door neighbor. I want to change the way you drive to work on Monday, desperately. I want to change the way you look at men and women in general. I want to change priorities, how you function in the home. This is all Christianity. James, by the time he comes into chapter 2, and we touched on this the last time I was here because I keep notes on everything that I talk about. We looked at verses 8 and 9 of chapter 2 independently. And I want to look at them briefly together and then take it to another level that we never did get to when I was here last time. In verses 8 and 9, James is dealing with, and it's actually chapter 2, verses 1 through 13. He's dealing with this issue of favoritism. And if you remember 2 years ago, maybe not, but we talked about what favoritism is. God does not show favoritism. That statement, do not show favoritism, it's mentioned 4 times in our New Testament. And every time it's illustrated that God does not show favoritism. Okay? You're not to show favoritism because God doesn't show favoritism, which probably would make you want to ask, what in the world is favoritism? Well, favoritism is a compound Greek word made up of 2 words which mean outward and face, or outward and countenance. So to show favoritism means that I view you in a way, the way I see your value, your worth, how I look at you is based on outside stuff, which means I like you because you have money, which is the illustration he uses in verses 2 and 3. Or I like you because you're good looking. Okay? God does not view you that way. Your value and your worth is not found in your looks. Your value, and are you with me? Your value and your worth is not found in your job or your athletic ability. God does not view you that way. God looks at the matter of the heart. He does not look on outside circumstance. I've heard people say, well, hey, I came to church this morning. I'm like, dude, you slept, but I was here. Praise the Lord. God will not, we know the verse, God will not be mocked. Did you know that you can come to church on Sunday and not come to church on Sunday? Think about this. Did you know that you can come and sing and not worship? You can give 10% and not tithe? That's why pastor is always harping, because we know Dennis harps. That's why pastor is always mentioning that you should be a joyful giver. It should come from a heart of I wanting to give. You'd say, really? Yeah. In fact, if you're not a joyful giver, it doesn't count. We still want your money. But the point that I'm getting at is that God honors the joyful giver. It's motive. You with me? It's motive, man. So favoritism is not, I don't see from the outside. And by the way, the issue that they had in the early church was, I show up to the building on Sunday, therefore I'm a good Jew. Yeah, but what's your motive for showing up? Pharisees showed up. Now, in the middle of this whole section on favoritism, and basically really what favoritism is if you show favoritism, then you don't see the way God sees, because God doesn't show favoritism, which means the way God sees is different than the way that I see. The way that God feels is different than the way that I feel. The way God operates is different than the way I operate. Oh, I do what he says, and I believe he's God, but it's not Christian. It's not this. So he's dealing with that. And in verses 8 and 9, he's dealing with basically two different people. Verse 8 is one person, and verse 9 is another. Verse 8 is the guy who doesn't show favoritism, which means he sees the way God sees and he feels the way God feels. And verse 9, that guy does show favoritism, which means he doesn't see the way God sees and he doesn't feel the way God feels. Okay? We all together? And from time to time, people will say, why does he keep, I've had people do this, why does he keep saying, are you with me? Because you're not with me. I'll look out and people will be looking around. You know, that light is dimmer than that other light over there. So I have to say, hey, come on, this is really important. Verses 8 and 9, two different people. The issue is favoritism. What's favoritism? God does not see like this. God sees like this. God's not impressed that you show up to a building on Sunday. He's not like in heaven going, well, I was going to send him to hell, but he went to church like every week. No. Many on the Lord's day are going to say, Lord, Lord. But not everyone who says, Lord, Lord, gets in the kingdom of heaven. God is not interested in you doing the right thing. He's interested in you being the right person. So the verse 8 guy we're going to look at, he's like this. The verse 9 guy is not. He still shows up to church. He's still religious, but he doesn't see the way God sees. He doesn't feel, he's not driven by what drives God. I want to look with you at the verse 9 guy, because the hang up in the verse 9 guy is sin. I want to talk to you a little bit about sin this morning. I live in Tennessee, okay, and I love it. It is awesome. You know, there's not too many social expectations for those in Tennessee. Just think that through. You know, it's a great place to live. I do. I love it. You know, you can get up and go to church and, you know, let's just move on. The point is, I live in Tennessee, and it's a really interesting place to live. But this right here is really in my area, and it's crazy because we live in the South, really. Tennessee is, and then in Georgia and all that area, but where I live in Tennessee, it's considered South, real South. And the Southern hospitality, everyone uses yes, ma'am, no, ma'am. We have, you know, really conservative, down-home roots, you know, kind of way of life. They don't, like, we still in our town, you can't buy alcohol, you can't buy tobacco on Sundays. Most stores aren't even open on Sundays. I mean, it's just really like 20 years behind, it seems, where most other communities are as I travel. And again, the yes ma'am, no ma'am, Southern hospitality, that's really prevalent. So we have very few serial killers where I live, basically, okay? Everybody's really nice. But it's difficult because they interpret nice as Christian. And it's not. They're like, I'm a Christian. How do you know? Well, I watch Fox News, first off. I'm like, are you kidding me? This ain't about politics, you know? Well, I vote this way, and I've got, you know, the American flag and the rebel flag in my trunk, you know, hanging up on the back of my Jeep. so I'm a Christian, you know. And it's honestly, it's not far from that. It's bizarre. If you're a nice person and you believe God exists, you're good to go. Unfortunately, that's not what the scriptures say. God doesn't want you just to acknowledge that he exists. Hey, God, I know you are real, and I believe in you. You're awesome. God's saying, I want to change how you think. I want you to feel the way that I feel. I want you to be passionate about what I'm passionate. I want to dwell inside of you. I want to change the way your marriage operates. I want to get in the middle of your home. I want to get in your thought life. I want you to hurt over the things I hurt for. I want you to see, identify with me. So in my area, sin is weird. We have a lot of people say, well, come on, no one's perfect. True story. I had a guy come to our church. He has had multiple affairs on his wife. And she finally left him. And he ranted about it. Well, she expect me to be perfect? I'm like, you're weird. Do you realize how weird you are? Well, everybody sins. And that's what they think in our area. No one's perfect. Come on, everybody robs the bank every once in a while. I mean, seriously, you know. Hey, I drive, slow drivers. You get that old lady, you know, drives in the fast lane. I mean, come on, everybody snaps and kills her every once in a while, okay? You can't hate me for that because we all want to do it, right? Yeah, so we all murder once in a while. No one's perfect. We live like that where I'm from. I talk to parents. How's your boy doing? Is he going to church? No, living with the girl, and they're partying and drinking. He got busted for drugs, and you know, in fact, he robbed the local convenience store. But hey, he got saved when he was 7, so he's good to go. That's bizarre. That's bizarre. However, and it's so difficult to live in that minefield and not have him lynch you, you know, every other day. James is dealing with that issue. See, what is sin? What is sin? And really quickly, just give you an introduction. Did you know, this is so good. Did you know that there are 2 kinds of sin? First off, there are 33 different Greek words for sin in our New Testament. 33. And they come from 10 different root words for sin. So these 10 different, absolutely different words for sin kind of develop into 33 different descriptions of sin. I need you to pay attention at this point. This is important. 10 different, completely different words that we use for sin that develop into 33 different definitions. You're like, that's a lot. Yeah, it's almost like it's a really big deal. And these 10 different words for sin fall into 2 categories. Okay? And they would fall in the categories of mistakes, accidents, unintentional, and rebellion. There are 2 different words for sin. The words in verse 9, in fact, you may not know it from your English translation, and if you can bring up in the NIV, if we have that, James chapter 2, verse 9, there are 2 different Greek words for sin in this verse. They are the words, the first one is the word sin, and the second one is the term lawbreaker. And I'll walk you through this. Look how this works. He says, now again, verse 8 guy is the guy that doesn't show favoritism. I mean, he sees the way God sees. He's living right. He's living in intimacy with God. But he comes into verse 9 and he says, but if you show favoritism. Now remember, what he's really saying is, meaning if you show favoritism, if you don't see the way God sees, you sin. That word for sin is the word hamartia. If you don't see the way God sees, you sin. You commit hamartia. Now, hamartia sin is a generic term for sin that has an emphasis on error. It was used in primitive Greek to describe literally Homer. I don't know if you've ever heard of Homer, the Greek guy Homer who did all those writings. He uses like 45 times in one of his books to describe how when a man in competition throws a spear at a target, if he misses the target, he sinned. Are you with me? He hamartia, which means he threw the spear, tried to hit the target, but missed. So that kind of sin, hamartia, is not intentional. It would be, by the way, the United States was established on Christian principles. Doesn't mean we're a Christian nation, but we were established on Christian principles, meaning we were not established on Islamic principles. That's pretty obvious. We weren't established on Sharia law. You can't kill your kids if they don't study, unfortunately. I know that's little preacher, little Islamic humor. Okay, just keep you with me. Okay, so you can't kill your kids. Okay, we don't have Sharia law. We're based on Christian principles. And in our Christian law, we make a distinction in our country between first-degree murder and manslaughter. Both are wrong. They're not correct. But one is intentional, one is not. Well, what would be the one that would be like manslaughter? Well, that's just the moron. We have this in Tennessee all the time. You know? That would be like me and Dennis going out to his house later today. And I tell Dennis, dude, let me show you something. I took up bow hunting. I've been really practicing for a week. And I tell Dennis to take this apple, stand about 40 feet over there. We do this when Charlene's not at home. And I tell Dennis to stand over there and put that apple on the top of his head. Super trusting guy, great guy. And I draw out my bow and arrow, and I draw it back, and I release it, and I kill Dennis, okay? I kill Dennis. It's a bad day in Banner. Well, the police come. I did not murder Dennis. I'm just a moron, and he's even a bigger moron, okay? We call that involuntary manslaughter. Well, it was not on purpose. I was not trying to kill him. I was just acting out of my, I'm limiting the gene pool, basically, is what I'm doing, okay? Narrowing things down and making them more healthy. That's what hamartia is. It's, in fact, John, if you ever heard of John Wesley, and you should heard of John Wesley because he's directly involved in what your church is doing. John Wesley called that form of sin missing the mark. It's not intentional. Now, put this in the sentence. This is really important. Put this in the sentence. He says to the guy that does not see the way God sees, he says, now, if you don't see the way God sees, you show favoritism, you are in error. You're in error. And then he goes on and says, and are convicted. The word convicted there literally means exposed. So God comes to this guy, who the guy is not evil, because he's not doing it intentionally. He just doesn't see the way God sees. And he says, hey, he exposes the area of his life where he doesn't see the way God sees. I call this 2-year-old sin. 2-year-olds commit hamartia. No one walks by the nursery and hears the 2-year-old screaming and stomping its foot and calls that normal. But also, no one walks by the nursery and hears the 2-year-old screaming and says, well, that kid's going to hell. Wow, yeah, get him saved quick. No one says that because that's how 2-year-olds act. They're not evil. They don't know any better. They're just a little off. You ever see anybody in the church who's just a little bit off? That's 2-year-old sin. Now, that's different. Hear me on this. The 2-year-old is different than the 50-year-old. When the 50-year-old, and you walk by the board meeting, and the 50-year-old sounds a lot like the 2-year-old, we don't say the same thing. Am I making a dent? Are you catching on this? See, the 2-year-old doesn't know any better. What James is saying is, listen, if you show favoritism, you don't see the way God sees. God comes to you and opens your eyes to where you don't see the way God sees. Because he wants to help you. Now, this is so beautiful. What condemns the verse 9 guy is not the fact that he doesn't see the way God sees. What condemns him is he doesn't let God change him. What separates you from God is not the fact that you're wrong, because everyone's wrong. What separates you from God is rebellion when you refuse to let him right you. You refuse to let him correct you. Are you listening to me? One of the reasons I say you listen, another reason is because people don't pay attention in services and then they go out and misquote me and make me look bad. Well, he said this. No, you were inattentive. Remember when you slept for about 30 minutes? Yes. What condemns you, what literally would label you as not the real thing, what would label you as religious and not Christian, is you have an area of your life where you've been wrong and God comes and speaks to you and you say, no, I'm doing it anyway. Which is what the verse 9 guy does. Listen to what he does. Verse 9, if you show favoritism, you don't see the way God sees, because God doesn't show favoritism. So the way God sees, I don't see. God comes and says, you're in error. You sin. You're missing the mark. You're a little bit off. You don't see the way I see right here. And he convicts you. He opens your eyes so you can see the way he sees. This guy, in verse 9, becomes a lawbreaker. The word lawbreaker is the most aggressive, damning, guilt-ridden version of sin we have in the New Testament. It's made up of the Greek words parabeno, which means to step around. The idea, it's choice. The idea is I'm walking along and there's a puddle right here. And I see it. And I make a choice because I've got on really cool Adidas. And I don't want to walk in that puddle because these things are expensive and I like them. So I make a choice to step around it. It's not hamartia, missing the mark. I actually tried to hit the target, I just missed. I didn't try to kill him. I love Dennis. It was an accident. Stepping around is choice. So there's a difference between committing adultery with your neighbor and losing your temper. Listen to how 1 John says this. Last thing real quick. If you have your Bibles, and I would like for you to see this on your own, and we didn't get to any of this last time I was here. 1 John chapter 5 is where I want to begin. When I read this normally, I have people that's come to church for a long time and go, I've never read that, which is awesome. I read this before, but it didn't stick. Listen to what he says, beginning in verse 16. Listen to how aggressive this is. By the way, the reason we're going to 1 John, it's a completely different author, and everyone in the New Testament talks about sin the same way. When you ever hear anybody say, I'm not perfect, okay, I agree. In fact, everyone really agrees with you. But what do you mean by that? Like everyone robs a bank? No, Christians don't rob banks. I lie to my parents and sneak out at night? No, Christians don't do that. Listen how he says it. Verse 16. If anyone sees his brother commit a sin that does not lead to death, he should pray and God will give him life. I refer to those whose sin does not lead to death. There is sin that leads to death, and I'm not saying that you should just pray about that. All wrongdoing is sin, and there's sin that does not lead to death. You're like, what does he mean there's sin that does not lead to death? Well, John's very plain. If you have Jesus living in your heart, you have eternal. If you die and you do not have Jesus in your heart, you will have eternal death. Eternal life, eternal death. Light, darkness, life, death. It's not rocket science. Well, you're saying, well, hold on. He's saying that there's sin that doesn't lead to death. You mean there's sin that doesn't lead to condemnation? Yeah, that's why we don't believe 2-year-olds go to hell. That's why in every Wesleyan church you'll ever go to, we talk about the age of accountability. You're all going, yeah, it's true. It's the age of accountability. Yeah, are 2-year-olds right? No, millennial, they are not. That's more cultural humor. Hysterical. Whatever, that's funny. 2-year-olds are not correct. They don't act right. Notice what he says. All wrongdoing is sin. But there's sin that does not lead to death. Is a 2-year-old right? Well, no, it's not right, but it doesn't know any better. But a 2-year-old and a 50-year-old throwing a temper tantrum at church are two different things. What's difference about them? The 50-year-old knows better. You know better. So John in his book talks about two kinds of sin. There's sin that condemns you and there's sin that does not condemn you. Almost done. There's sin that leads to death and sin that does not lead to death. He breaks these down. Go back with me. Listen to how he does this. Go back with me to 1 John chapter 1. And I want you to look with me beginning at verse 5. This is so good. He says in verse 5, this is the message that we heard from him and declare to you. Okay, in other words, he didn't get this at Starbucks. He said, God is light. Okay, we'll put that over here. God is light. In him there is no darkness at all. Listen how aggressive this is. Verse 6. If we claim to have fellowship with him, who's in the light, yet we walk in darkness, we're a liar. Isn't that aggressive? What's John saying? John says, listen, God is this, God is not that. If you claim to walk with him and are living in that, something's wrong with you. Well, I'm a Christian. Yeah, but didn't you rob that bank last week? Well, no one's perfect. Something's wrong with you. You're really weird. Oh, I'm a Christian. Didn't you just have an affair on your wife? Well, no one's perfect. You're right. No one is perfect. But you know better than that. What are you saying? You cannot be a Christian and look at God and say, I know exactly how you feel about this, and I don't care, I'm doing it anyway. Christians don't live that way. That's called rebellion. That's the sin that leads to death. Really quickly. If you go down a few verses from verse 5 and verse 8, listen to what he says. This will shock some of you. This is my favorite verse in the whole Bible, simply because it makes Nazarenes uncomfortable. Listen to this. Verse 8. If we, that's plural, listen to this, that's plural. If we claim to be without sin, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us. If there's anyone in this room right now that says, I'm without sin, well, first off, ask around. Start with your spouse. Aren't I perfect, honey? Okay? And if she's not brave enough, I am. It's plural. If we claim to be without sin, guess which word for sin is used there? Is it parabeno or hamartia? It's hamartia. What is he saying in verse 8? If you and I claim to be without error, if we claim to be dead on, no room for growth, yep, I'm just waiting to go to heaven, kind of hanging around. The only reason I come to church, help everybody else out, I've already heard it. You've got problems, man. No, seriously, like really, talk to Dennis immediately. If you claim to be without sin, this is Bible. This is hysterical. I had a lady one time, I heard her say, this is hysterical. It's always the little old ladies, by the way. I'm at this church. This might have been in Missouri, actually. That's what makes it even more funny. But this little old lady, I heard her say, she's like 4 or 5 rows back, she said to her friend, give me your translation. Because she was like, this guy's lying. I was like, hey, baby, I'm waiting. Just go and ask her. I don't think I called her baby because that would have been weird. But I said, hey, I'm waiting. It's not a translation thing. Everyone is growing. Even when you're in intimacy with him, there's areas of your life where you don't look like him, and yet you don't see it. The way you talk, the way you act. I had a broken definition of masculinity for years. I grew up in a home where the man, hey, I'm a man. What does that mean? I'm tough. You talk to me, I'm going to knock your teeth out. Tough guy. Walk around flexing your muscles. You know the tough guys at the gym? That was the home I was raised in. And it wasn't until years later Jesus came to me and said, Jeremiah, do you realize I'm a real man? He said, I'm a real man. I'm what a real man looks like. Jesus wasn't a coward. He wasn't a wimp. And God had to correct my definition of masculinity. Oh, well, you wasn't a Christian? I was a Christian. But I didn't look like him in that area of my life, and I didn't even know it. This is what he says in verse 8. If you claim to be without sin, no room for growth, you're deceived. You're lying to yourself. Go to verse 9. This is the most famous verse. But if we confess our sin, which is we confess the areas of our life, the verse 9 guy did not confess it. If we confess our sin, he's faithful and just to forgive us our sin and purify us from all unrighteousness. The verse 9 guy, see what changed? And here's what I want to end here. Maybe you could come. Would you mind coming and playing some piano for us? Here's the deal. And I get really, I have talks with my generation about this. The 20s. it seems like my generation feels different than the 40s and 50s, those old people. I agree. Can you pray in your seat? This is important. Can you pray in your seat? Well, duh. Yeah, obviously you can. But let me ask you this. How many times have you come and sat there and said, I'm not going to do that anymore, and been the exact same? I think there comes a time in your life, especially if you've been tolerating rebellion in your life, and you come and say, I know God has not wanted me to be wrapped up in this. Pornography is a huge one in our culture. That's adultery. You know that, right? You're committing adultery. Jesus said, if you lust after a woman in your heart, you've already committed adultery. Do not kid yourself. Lying. You cannot look at your parents and say, no, I'm going to bed. I'm not going to sneak out, and then sneak out. You know when God is speaking to you. If you have been living in rebellion in your life and God speaks to you in a setting like this, and you're sitting there and your heart is beating, you probably should get out of your seat and come and pray. And you can say, no, I can pray right here. Well, and I'm for you. But I wonder if next time I come here, you'll be doing the same thing. Do you guys know that no one ever quits rebelling against God? No one ever quits sinning like that. You have to be delivered from that. You can't just say, I'm going to quit doing that. You have to be saved from sin. Are you listening to me? You have to be delivered, set free. You have to kneel and say, I rebelled. I gave the enemy a permission in my life, and I've lived in rebellion. I need you to save me. You can't just decide, I don't think I'm going to do that anymore. It does not work that way. He who sins is a slave to sin. You have to be set free. Now, can you do that? I've seen people do it in their seat, but eventually, there's times when you need to come forward and respond. Not for me, for you. Now, there's another end of the spectrum where there's those of us here, and I get worried about this group almost more than this group. It's the person that's been coming to church for 30, 40 years and has never come to the altar. And they haven't grown, and the only time they testify is about what God did in their life 30 years ago. I've got a problem with that. Because if you haven't grown in 30 years, something is desperately wrong. It tells me you're not listening, you're not seeking, you're not open. And this person here is more dangerous than the person living in rebellion. Because this creates legalism. I am growing like a weed. I took on a pastorate this last year. And I'm pastoring a church. They haven't killed me yet, haven't lynched me, haven't fired me. I'm growing. He's tailoring my language and opening my eyes where I've been critical and maybe not as, I'm growing. We're entering into I've got a 14-year-old boy now. I don't know how parents survive with junior high boys. He's going into high school. When's the last time he's done something new in your life? I'm going to give you an opportunity to respond. And again, if you've been living in rebellion and saying, well, nobody's perfect, come on, man. He loves you, but you're killing yourself and everyone else around you. Christians do not live in rebellion against God and are cool with it. I've had a person ask me, I had a person ask me this morning on the way to church, happened to give me a random call, asked me what I'm going to be speaking on. I told him. He said, Jeremiah, in the last 25 years since you become a Christian, have you ever sinned rebellion? And my response was, not for very long. He said, what do you mean by that? Has there been times when God said, Jeremiah, this is exactly how I feel? And I said, no, forget it. I'm not doing it. And then a few hours later, I come back and say, well, change your mind. And I respond. But one thing I have not done, because I cannot do, is I can't come to him and say, well, I know you feel this way, but I don't care. Can I still go to heaven? It just doesn't work. So we're going to have a time of response, and I want to get you out of here this morning. We were a little bit long. I apologize. Worship was long. But I want to give you an opportunity to pray. But you guys realize there's a day and age we live in where religion does not win anybody. In fact, religion is so nauseating. I'm into people that are madly in love with Jesus. And if you are a man, you're the spiritual head of your home, which doesn't have anything to do with you're the boss. You're to be the first to look like Jesus. If you aren't, you should, there's room to grow. If you aren't and you don't care, shame on you. Seriously, that's pathetic. Mom, you're going to be the one that your kids look up to, your daughters, your sons. There's no more room for wishy-washy stuff. You've been flirting around with some things that you know are not right. It's easy. Say, Jesus, I've been an idiot. I've said no to you and I realize it. Man, let me see the way you see. Make me want what you want. And then in a couple minutes, we're just going to spend some time in prayer. No pressure. Just respond to the Lord. And then I'm going to close us. But God's speaking to you this morning. And maybe He's pulling you up another level. I want you to have freedom to respond. Jesus, we love you this morning. I thank you for the truth of your word. God, as always, it's good to be here. Of course, there's so many different families that I've come to grow and love. And we think the world of Dennis and Charlene. And I honestly feel like this is another home when I'm here. I seem to preach better. I feel better. I feel like I'm having conversations with people. Father, there's a number of people in this church that just love you. I mean, just you ooze out of their pores. This church has been known to have, this church has been known, Lord, to have a dynamic youth program and a phenomenal children's program. It's phenomenal. The enemy would love to undermine what's going on here with just people that are not after you. So I pray, Lord, in these moments as you speak to us, we would respond. Give us the courage when you deal with us that we would respond. Let you do in us what you want to do. Heads are bowed and eyes are closed. We're going to open the altars. If you'd like to come and pray, I'd like to join you.